Vice Chair Miles, we are recording the meeting and we are streaming live on YouTube. We can start the proceeding now.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening, to the board members and also to the staff who are here to present the information to us. At this time, I will call the meeting to order. We will actually, at this time, we don't have a quorum, so we will not take any action until a few more members get here. So we're going to actually skip past item 2 on the agenda, which is the approval of the minutes. And we're going to go straight into our information items. And at this time, I will turn the floor over to Mr. Longy, who will provide us with an update on the policies of resubmitted projects with cost overruns. So Mr. Longy, floor is yours.
Thank you. Keith Jasper was going to queue up some comments to kind of catch you up from, I think, your previous meeting. This topic started with the approval of the 2-year update. So,
right. Thanks, Mike. Good evening, everyone. Yes, at your June meeting, June 20th meeting, you hopefully recall that we came to you with staff recommendations for the 6-year program. The committee had a great discussion. There were some concerns about a couple of projects that our staff recommendations recommended those 2 projects not be funded for the reason that both projects had previously received NVTA funding and had indicated to us that with the NVTA funding, those projects would be fully funded. And so therefore, our recommendation was that if the project had a cost overrun, then there was a separate process for dealing with cost overruns, and that we would recommend that those projects not be funded and they should look to other sources of funding to address the issue. Some committee members wanted to override the staff recommendations, and an alternate or substitute motion was presented and to do that, but it failed. The votes were, I think, 4 yeas, 4 nays, and 1 abstain, and so the substitute motion did not carry, and this committee subsequently endorsed the NVTA staff recommendations 7-2, and then those recommendations went forwards to our planning and programming committee a couple of days later, and then ultimately to the July authority, where some of this discussion at both the planning and programming committee and at the full authority meeting, the discussions about the staff recommendations for not funding 2 projects was the subject of extensive discussion. This committee made an additional resolution which did pass for NVTA staff to consider a couple of additional things as part of the program. One of those was to do with we call long-term benefit, which is a statutory requirement that puts some obligations on NVTA to ensure that over the long term, essentially each member jurisdiction received its fair share of the benefit associated with NVTA funding in proportion to revenues generated by each jurisdiction. And the other thing that was requested that staff investigate a new policy for dealing with projects that are resubmitting because of cost overruns. And both this committee, the Planning and Programming Committee, and ultimately NVTA agreed to explore that. And that is why our CFO is here tonight to explain to you where we are in the process of developing that requested policy. Hopefully, I can take any questions on that if there are any, but basically it goes back to the discussion the committee had at its meeting in June, and what followed in the weeks after that at one other committee, and actually 2 other committees, because the Technical Advisory Committee also met the same night you did. They had no issues with the recommendation and endorsed them unanimously. The Technical Advisory Committee did meet last week. They also did not have a quorum, so they did not feel comfortable making anything, any strong guidance or feedback. But generally, the feedback was that they understood why NVTA staff recommendations were the way they were, and the reasons and the rationale behind that. And I can't say they supported it because they didn't take a vote on it. But no concerns were raised with the approach that NVTA staff had taken. So with that, if there are no questions, I'll hand over to Mr. Longby for a discussion about the proposed policy.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will note that the TAC asked, where do we go from here? And we said, well, we'll probably be back with more information. And they weren't able to take a formal position, but they kind of agreed to a summation of leaning towards no. I'll also note that Supervisor Walkinshaw was Chair McKay's designee for the authority meeting last week. So he got this briefing as well. So you do have somebody on PCAC that is going to be fully up to speed on it. Again, my name is Mike Longby. I know your pictures more than you, I think, have ever met me. So I'm the CFO for the authority. Been with it since 2013, brought funding to the operation. I want to say welcome to our new facility. Sorry for the automatic doors automatically locking. We've got a couple bugs like that to work out. I appreciate your patience. As Keith had noted, at the July authority meeting, a directive was made to come back to the authority with a policy regarding cost overruns in December. It's a pretty aggressive time frame. And I'm going to lean back on extensive amount of work that was done in 2015 and 2016. It was started in July of 2015 and concluded in October of 2016. Whereas the authority at that time established contingency reserves to fund cost overruns. Sounds easy. As a financial transaction, it was easy. But then the issues came up when we started to try to put policies around who gets to use that money. When does it get to be used? Under what circumstances? Is it fair? A lot of questions came up. So what I'm going to do is walk through, before I get into those details, I'm going to walk through what already exists. We have, for every project that's approved and gets into an active status, we do a standard project agreement called an SPA. That language never changes. It's not customized by projects. The appendices change because project can be buying a bus, the project can be building a road, it can be funding metro, it can be a lot of things. So all of that happens with the appendices. That document is essentially a contract between the authority and the project sponsor. Project sponsor obviously can be a county, a city, it can be a town, it can be a transit agency. It can be a state department, VDOT, DRPT, the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority. That's pretty much our customer base, actually. So the first part of that is if a project sponsor experiences, and I'm around 3A1, bottom of first page. If a project sponsor experiences a cost overrun, they're supposed to let the CEO know about it and give details to her about that. So number one, we can be aware because we always want to look at the risks that are associated with the projects. We want the projects to come to fruition. I'll be honest with you, that seldom happens. As a matter of fact, it has not ever really happened as a formal request. Usually we hear about cost overruns via the local media. Yeah. Yep. So, we have an issue there that an avenue that does exist hasn't been getting used for 10 years. Flipping the page, also in the SPA, it says the NVTA CEO will initially review the request and all supporting documentation with the CFO After that, the CEO and CFO will make a recommendation to the finance committee. We've never gone through that process, simply because nobody's ever triggered it. The finance committee would then use its independent consideration and then make a recommendation to the authority as to whether or not the cost overrun should be funded or any action should be taken. The last bullet there, number 5. Nothing herein shall require or obligate any party to commit or obligate funds to the project beyond those funds that have been duly authorized and appropriated by their respective governing bodies. So the contract actually does not set out that there's an obligation on the part of the authority to fund cost overruns. And likewise, the project sponsor doesn't have to put more money in it either, but the project sponsor did agree to give us the project based on the terms of their application and the funding already provided. For this next section, which I'm going to go into detail, and hopefully not too much, but I'll go into detail on the 15-16 study. And again, there was a lot of work done there. In addition to the finance committee, Monica Backman convened an advisory panel that included DOT directors and other staff members from around the region, included people from transit agencies, to basically look at these issues. As I work through here, you'll actually see in some of these bullets, they've got like a 4I in the parentheses. That actually traces back to the October 5th, 2016 action taken by the authority to not use the reserve fund that was being set up to fund cost overruns, the contingency reserve. Whether you're funding a cost overrun from a contingency reserve or whether you're funding it straight out of PAYGO, it's essentially the same thing. If you take money out of PAYGO, you've reduced it, whether or not you put it in a contingency reserve and then fund something with it, or if you just pay it out of PAYGO. So what I've done with the wording on this is tried to steer away from using the wording contingency reserve and just call it cost overruns. We also have to recognize that cost overruns is a very broad term. I mean, there are legitimate reasons why projects hit cost overruns. There are also reasons that could have been avoided. And I'm just using the term cost overrun generically because a big part of the policy issue is whether or not the situation could have been prevented. So as we're working, we've been tasked with coming up with a policy. One of the first stages of the policy development is it a policy to do something, fund cost overruns, or is it a policy not to do something? And I'm going to let you know, as CFO, my job's to manage risk. My job is to have fiscal stability. My bias, I'll be upfront with you, is no. Based on the work back in 15-16, because all those things are still true today. So diving into this, the advisory panel, and I'm on page 2B1. The advisory panel recognized that few, if any, project grants from other sources came with the exception that a contingency fund would be available to the project sponsor. We could not find one in 15-16. We still haven't found one. I'm saying few because that's the language we chose, because if I said definitely it never happens, one will pop up somewhere. But we've not identified any other funding source that says, oh, if you have a cost overrun, just come back and we'll give you more money. Advisory panel noted that under the terms of the NVTA standard project agreement, the project sponsor agrees to provide a complete project as described in the SPA, and therefore has already agreed to and conceivably planned for contingencies. And I'll note here, we don't examine the contingency levels for projects. We give the project sponsor absolute free hand to do that. because nobody is going to know their project and their project characteristics better than the local knowledge that comes from the cities, counties, and towns and transit agencies. It's a lot different. Widening Route 1 anywhere is a lot more difficult than putting a new road through a cornfield. Funding cost overruns have the potential to shift project risk in some measure from the project sponsor to the NVTA. The advisory panel determined that NVTA should not absorb the risk. The advisory panel questioned if the contingency cost could be meaningfully disclosed without additional disclosure of all cost components. I can make my contingency number look really good, but still keep my project cost competitive by underfunding part of the estimate that contingency goes to. So if we get in and say, well, why does this phase, why have you burned through your contingency? Well, we had 50% contingency. But did you underestimate the actual phase of the project? Such disclosure would be expensive, time-consuming, potentially adding little value to the actual project. One of the things the advisory panel was very concerned about in 15-16 was making a bureaucracy. The authority actually has 20 staff positions currently. Those people do a lot of work. None of them have the skills to parse out contingency levels. We would have to hire consultants. We would have to hire additional staff in order to be adequately look at those numbers. Your jurisdictions already have that staff. They're doing it. Or when you spin up a project, you are hiring consultants that do that for you. The advisory panel cautioned that in an environment of broad economic changes, such as we've gone through in the last 4 years, raw and finished material costs increases, a significant number of projects could face escalating costs at the same time. So back when this was looked at in July 15th, the CPI, Consumer Price Index, measuring inflation, was 0.2%. It currently topped, or it recently topped at a little over 9%. I mean, you've heard of the Regional Jurisdiction Agency Coordinating Committee. It's a monthly meeting for, planners mostly around the region. I was on that, realized that many of the folks on that meeting were half my age. And they're in their mid-30s and said, these folks don't know what inflation is. They haven't lived through double-digit inflation. And so I started warning then, but that warning in 2020, 2021, we still have projects that haven't used their money for 8 years. So a project that might have had a reasonable inflation contingency 8 years ago suddenly gets hit with 9% and is at a risk that the rest of the region should bear. Again, we don't set standards. One of the things that some project funders do is say, for this type of project phase, you should have a contingency of 10% or 20%. Right of way should be higher than design. Utility relocation should be higher than many other things. But again, we leave that to the project sponsors because they have the best body of knowledge. Plus, the project is already paying for that body of knowledge. If we were to make recommendations on this inflation, how would they be formulated? Is there an equity issue when some project sponsors may have committed additional local funds for cost overruns while others are depending upon NVTA? And we would, in order to be equitable, we would have to parse and sort through that. And again, we are currently not doing any of that. We expect the project sponsors to put their best feet forward. The advisory panel recognized NVTA project evaluation and selection process, which are based on total project costs. So even if we're funding a phase of a project, the project is ranked based on its total cost. Could be impacted through appropriation of additional NVTA funding beyond the original agreed upon amount. So the law says congestion reduction relative to cost has to be a key determinant in selecting projects for funding. So if a project comes back 5 years later and says, I have an overrun, do we remodel that project on the current situations 5 years now when it was benchmarked against the pool of candidate applications that were in that 2-year update? Or do we go back 5 years and remodel all those projects in order to make sure that we are getting the congestion reduction relative to cost that we're supposed to be focused on as determined by the General Assembly? Cost is a statutorily required consideration. Additional cost would impact the score and may have changed the initial funding decision. The ability and willingness of NVTA to fund cost overruns may induce some project submitters to reduce their project contingency or other cost factors. Therefore, NVTA's willingness to fund a cost overrun for the stated purpose of reducing risk to the project completion may unintentionally cause a broader risk shift. Multi-phase projects, in other words, a project that comes in and says, I just want X amount for design, have a tendency to absorb their cost overruns. If they are coming in and asking for design and they get to 30% design and then come back for relocation, they have a better body of knowledge. Those costs would then be part of the next project description, evaluation, and rating. As I go through 4 and beyond, think of the bureaucracy. Past project performance, request for additional funds would need to be made a formal part of the contingency request and possibly future project evaluation processes. Projects get delayed for very legitimate reasons. Projects also lose community support. We have seen that a number of times. Boards change. All of those features can impact whether or not a project has a cost overrun. The NVTA contingency reserve, or I put in quotationals, additional pay-go, had been referred to as a last resort option. The advisory panel questioned how NVTA at current staffing levels in 15-16, and it's not gotten better because we're not staffed for this, would be able to ensure other options are exhausted. If additional funding were to be offered, the advisory panel recommended localities be required to commit their local distribution 30% funds as part of the other option noted above prior to making a contingency request. However, this raised additional questions. What if the locality's 30% funds were already committed by contract or other governing body action? Are there equity issues with agencies since they do not receive 30% funds? And a good example of that is PRTC. Its bus service doesn't get 30%, but Fairfax County and Loudoun both run their own bus services essentially as a department function. So is that fair that we expect Loudoun County, if it has a cost overrun on its Loudoun Transit operation, not operation, but new project, to use its 30%, but PRTC is exempt because it just doesn't get any? Should and how will project sponsors be required to affirm they have no other financial options? Again, huge bureaucracy. Given the complexity and scope of various fund structures and budgeting as well as accounting methods, this could be extraordinarily complex, intrusive, and time-consuming, further delaying projects as this process goes through. I have been fortunate enough in almost 40 years of local government finance, all in Northern Virginia, to work for 3 jurisdictions: Prince William, Arlington, and Fairfax. All of them are AAA rated. All of them, none of them have significant accounting process problems. All of them do things differently. Fine methodology for doing it. But we would have to have the staff that can look in and see, is the way Fairfax County is approaching its fund accounting requirements show an equal result as another jurisdiction. I shouldn't have used Fairfax. I should have just said jurisdiction A and B, trying to single anybody out. Having a contingency reserve and thus a portion of the project risk being transferred to NVTA would necessitate the requirement for project contingency assumptions to be disclosed as part of the project descriptions. This disclosure would then become part of the project application and assessment process. When we got to this point in, I guess it was 16, we had set aside $8.6 million into the contingency reserve. The authority took action to start funding the reserve, but we couldn't use it until this policy had been developed. At that point in time, we estimated that there were $24 million in project cost overruns. I don't say this lightly because CFOs don't like to do this, but give or take $100 to $200 million. Give or take $100 to $200 million. We are potentially looking at $1 billion of cost overruns. They are not all, some of those are natural. Some of them are misestimates on the far side. We are currently producing funding programs at 650 to just under 700 million every 2 years. So if we were to fund that billion, you're going to go essentially 3 years and not establish any new capital projects. For a risk that was never on the radar for the authority absorbing at that time when those projects were approved. Any questions on the 15-16 work before I embark into what we've learned over the almost 10 years since?
Any questions, anyone?
Well, I have a question. I came late, that was at the polls, re-election stuff. I'm trying to catch up on this. Now, you were saying that these contingency reserves were not considered in 15-16, and we need to adopt a policy that will address this?
Well, the first question is, does the authority want to fund cost overruns writ large? Again, my recommendation is no. Then we write a policy, because it was pointed out to us, we don't have a policy, do not fund cost overruns. So then we would draft a policy that says we don't fund cost overruns. If the direction were to fund cost overruns, then the challenge would be to draft a policy that addresses all of the concerns that were raised in 15-16, which led everybody to saying we shouldn't be doing this.
How we get those contingency funds in our coffers? How would we acquire this money to fund these cost overruns?
Our revenue stream is set by the General Assembly.
So you just said $1 billion in potential. They're not giving us $500 million.
They have no plans to give us any more money because we have cost overruns.
Okay.
I can take a sentiment from Senator Boysko at the authority meeting. And she was pretty clear because she said she won't be able to attend the November authority meeting. And she made it pretty clear she does not support funding cost overruns.
Yeah. Okay. Now, my question again is, when they put their bids out or plan these projects, it takes years for them to come to a point where they can start digging in the ground. All that time is costing money because the supply chain issue, just inflation as a whole, is compounding the project cost.
Mm-hmm.
So is there any method that can be included in their predictions that will maybe offset some of these cost overruns in their design in preparation to do the project?
Typically, in addition to establishing a contingency reserve within the project and project's cost estimate, you also project inflation.
Mhm.
You know, you project the delays. Again, this is all information that would be very difficult for authority staff to second guess.
Right.
But, and we do not parse out the estimates from the project sponsors exactly for that reason. If we were asked in, again, this is the benefit of having somebody who was here, I'm your first and only CFO thus far. So this was very much part of the discussion. Should the authority set percentages for contingency? Should the authority set projections for inflation, present value of money, future value of money? All of those are formulas that go into these larger project estimates. The worry then was if we said, okay, inflation's 0.2% and is never going to get above 1%, then wouldn't the authority own that problem that just got created?
Yeah.
And the authority's crystal ball on that is no better than anybody else's. You also have to look, and I use VDOT as an example, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for VDOT at the Commonwealth level, especially in Northern Virginia. But VDOT does fund its cost overruns. But it also owns the project.
Right.
It controls the project. It controlled that project typically from its initial concept phase to when it gets the funding.
Mhm.
And VDOT can do what you can do in city, counties, and towns, is if it has a project that needs more money, they can delay another project, potentially remove another project. The authority has a very difficult time doing that because it's not just, we're not looking at statewide. We're not even looking region-wide. We've got to balance what was given to approved for Dumfries
Mhm.
with Prince William, Arlington, Alexandria. Would it be fair to say, okay, your project now is delayed because we have to take money over to this other side of the region?
Yeah. Okay.
Again, the idea was good to fund a contingency reserve, but where it got really complicated was when we started trying to draft a policy that would make the use of the reserve fair, equitable, and accountable to everybody, while at the same time limiting the authority's risks. All right.
That's not.
So moving into 2024, we ended that work in 2016. The decision was made not to have a cost overrun contingency. The money was moved back into the regional revenue fund, and that $8.6 million went off to fund some project back in 16. What we've learned over almost the next decade is additional policy considerations. The accuracy of cost estimates is critical to the integrity of the congestion reduction relative to cost calculations. When we had this discussion before, we did a 14 slate of projects were approved. Then we did a 15-16 program. But now we have a 6-year program where we add 2 years on. The next 2 years coming up are 30 and 31. So project sponsors are used to dealing with those out years. Therefore, they have the mathematical experience in making those projections. And again, we are not constraining them to build a reserve, but they got to balance their total project cost against their ability to finish the project under the costs that they're going to get from NVTA. Applicants are responsible for including the sufficient contingency, and to mitigate the impact of future cost overages and underestimates. One of the things I do know, we talked a bit about projects being delayed, and of course, a delay increased cost. We have a thing called forward appropriations. Forward appropriations. If a project sponsor comes to us and says, NVTA, you approved me for funding in 2029, but I'm ready to go. I can start this project this year. We actually go through a process because when the authority commits its funding to a project, it commits all of it in the year of appropriation. The reason we have such a big investment portfolio is because they don't spend it all out in the same year. Some of these projects, even if they're moving like clockwork, are going to take 5 years to do. So what we do is if a project can move up in the calendar, we take that investment portfolio and we use that cash flow. Probably not a strategy you've heard about in your jurisdictions because your auditors would go crazy. We had an extensive sit down with our independent external auditor and said, this just makes sense for us, the authority. Can we, what can we do to allow us to do that? And basically we have some checks and balances in place to make sure that we're not getting past our revenue stream, we're not getting past our cash flow. So while we do talk about delayed projects, and of course that's always an unfortunate thing, we do fund projects that can move faster. We have not been in a position yet where we have had to turn down a forward appropriation request. Doesn't matter if it's $100 million or if it's $100,000. We're going to run it through the same mathematical financial models to make sure the authority as a board doesn't get over its skis, so to speak. But we can do that. The pandemic affected supply chains, resulting in cost escalations, but project delivery was already lagging in many cases. In fiscal 2025 budget, the authority, we had requested some additional staff, and the authority basically said, yes, but have them focused on project delivery. We need to get the projects moving. So that's already a problem that we have. Should NVTA provide additional funding if project delivery delays were the primary cost of the escalation? How will we know? I once had a project sponsor, and this was years ago, when we were talking about projects that were approved for the project sponsor, and I'm really not going to name a name, said, oh, thank you. We forgot we had that project. It was a small one, but yeah, still. Should additional funding be considered if cost underestimates were the cause? And how would we be able to determine them? Severely underestimate costs, and you can almost guarantee your project's going to get approved because its congestion reduction relative to cost is going to rank really high. Parameters to be addressed if the authority approves cost overruns. Will the policy be retroactive? I'm not a fan of funding cost overruns, but at the same time, how can you say no? I mean, ultimately, it's a question for you to make a recommendation to the authority, but project sponsors must document which other funding sources have been sought. Should the overrun funding be delayed until those funding applications have been determined to be successful or not? Well, again, you're slowing down the project to take on a risk that wasn't the authority's. If project transfers are approved, donor and donee projects should not be allowed to submit future applications for the same projects. Here's my concern. A project has lost its community support, but it has money attached to it. A project sponsor starts to transfer money out of that project onto a project that has a cost overrun. Maybe they know better than we do that that project's never going to get done, but in the meantime, that money has gotten filtered out when it should have come back to the regional revenue fund pot and everybody have an equal shot at getting it.
So I'm sorry, so has that money gone to other projects or has that money gone to that?
It could go to other projects. And again, you've upset the congestion reduction relative to cost analysis that was done previously. And essentially, a project sponsor could run their own kind of shadow bank. I mean, we are talking, some of these projects are easily tens of millions, stretching 100 million and above.
I think we talked about that last meeting we had, about taking money from one project and putting it to another, even though the project was not on the higher priority list, moving it up. I think that was Arlington or someone talked about that. Yeah, okay.
Should NVTA not fund right-of-way, utility relocation, construction costs, which typically have the largest cost variables, unless the project has completed the preliminary engineering phase or is at, we'll call it 30, 50, 70% design. Exemptions should only be permissible with a governing body resolution stating that no resubmittals to NVTA would be made. And number 7 is kind of redundant with what I was saying. No transfers of regional revenue fund between projects under any circumstances. We have seen transfers, and this is where you want to leave some flexibility. We have seen transfers where a project sponsor said, I want to transfer between these 2 projects because this project can move ahead and I don't have money for it. But in 2 years, I'm willing to backfill that money with our own jurisdictional money and still complete the second project. That's one of those situations where definitely we need to document it. But at that point, I think that's a fair accommodation. So Councilmember Snyder from Falls Church said at the authority meeting, he indicated, he was kind of on the no camp, but can we look for a circuit breaker? Well, we do have that circuit breaker in the SPA already, and maybe we can enhance that for project sponsors that are basically in a cash flow issue rather than a funding issue. And we have been looking at those. We do that level of staff review on the finance side is not real burdensome, but in the cases of where it has worked out, it has worked out very, very well. And again, the key thing there is the authority really isn't absorbing risk. If anything, it's reducing risk by helping the project sponsor bring the project to conclusion. Next steps, we've talked to the TAC, the PCAC, will be to PPC. We are going to be talking to RJAC. We had one discussion with them in October. We get to go through this again tomorrow. But they've already been through this level of it, so we'll be more engaged in the conversation. Again, as your CFO, I put my cards on the table. I'm not in favor of funding cost overruns, but this committee and other committees make recommendations to the authority, and whatever the authority decides to do, obviously we will work out. With that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
If I could, Chair. I appreciate the history, certainly. I think, speaking only for myself, I wasn't in this line of work 10 years ago, so I wouldn't have known, honestly, the prior evaluation that was done, and I do appreciate it. And it is useful, to know that you came to that decision. Am I understanding correctly, though, that the current SPA, though frequently, if ever invoked, does provide, a project coming back to you guys and saying, this thing has happened.
Yep.
Is there anything you can do to help?
And it calls for a lot of disclosure.
Sure. But I'm just saying, should we heed, the CFO's guidance here and sort of keep the 2016, status quo in place? There does still remain, if we change nothing essentially, and we don't create a cost overrun policy, recreate contingency, there is still this, I don't know, break in place of emergency, you know, sort of element. I just wanted to make sure that I understood that, because you were saying like it's never been used and there's never been a formal request, but it does exist. Yeah, so there's a little bit of comfort for me in that. I mean, I think you've already alluded to it. My concern and what happened, I think, at that last meeting is that, like you said, you know, certain projects are way more likely to have an unintended, you know, or than others. You know, putting a road through a cornfield, there's just a lot less that's going to come up than something like building a bridge to the airport,
Yep.
you know, in the environmental studies and such. So I think that's what triggered that dialogue last time, was their sense that we couldn't have known, you know, we couldn't have anticipated elements of this. There was references in here, and I was trying to, you know, is phasing as from a CFO's perspective, is phasing your project one of the best ways to avoid potentially finding yourself in a cost overrun environment, or to minimize the degree to which you've run over at a point in a project?
I think it relies a lot on the project. And let's use a technology project that advance traffic lights for buses and stuff like that. You know, those are usually pretty well constrained, and they have a really high return for the dollars that are invested. BRT on Route 1, Fairfax. You know, we're doing $100 million increments in that, and they will be back. And I think that's appropriate. And the other thing I'd like to note, and I'll ask Keith to help me out a little bit with this, is a project that comes in and says in their application, we're fully funded with this number. And we didn't tell them that they had to cut that number in half, or we don't tell them that they should have doubled it. But they told us in the application that they're fully funded with that number. They do get credit for that. I'm not sure how it works out because it's in the planning world, but they do get, you know, credit for coming forward with a project that's fully funded.
When they declare that they're fully funded, does that include a contingency clause or funding?
Our assumption is yes.
I mean, assuming that, but does it laid out in there?
We don't look at that level of detail. They have complete flexibility to protect themselves to the level that they think is prudent to protect themselves.
But if they're, okay, like follow up on that, if they're looking for help, if they have an overrun, they should be able to disclose that to the NVTA and say, look, in case I have overrun, I have this money set aside. And then that
We
would not,
assume that it's there.
we're assuming again.
Yeah.
But that goes to your point about staffing though, right?
Yep.
I mean, you can only break down the individual application, but so far, and that's the point at which you're assuming jurisdictions with staffs greater than yours and consultants on hire are poking at the things you can't poke at.
Yep. And we essentially do not do a financial or fiscal review of the project applications as far as what made up, where did they get to the amount that they're requesting, or more importantly, because sometimes they don't, oftentimes they don't request us to fund the full amount, but where did they determine the total project cost? We can hire contractors and we can do that. But you're going to obviously add time into the application review cycle and costs for essentially what I have to question what benefit. Because in most cases, unless, and I don't expect this to happen, especially if we bring in a review process, we don't really have bad actors.
No.
We have mistakes happen, but we really don't have bad actors, if you will. But when finance people do this stuff, we always look for the bad actors because that's in our DNA. That's what we're supposed to do. Finance as a control entity. And we would have to kind of structure it with that level of granularity.
But everybody here is anticipated to be a repeat applicant.
Yes.
So they have a very clear incentive to not be a bad actor, because they're gonna come back again in 2 years and ask for more money on something else. Yeah. So our task in this moment is to
Well, we can't take any action.
Yeah.
It is, this basically open discussion. Mr. Jasper, will this come back to us next month, or where we can take a vote on it, or we can make a recommendation?
Well, this evening, we have nothing for you to take a vote on, even if you have a quorum. This committee, it has a bylaw which states that you need to have 2 meetings before you can take action anyway. So that would not fit with your bylaw to take action tonight. At this stage, your next. This committee actually, I do not believe we've scheduled your next meeting, because it,
No.
as the 4th Wednesday, it will be the day before Thanksgiving, and we've always felt that would be a bad day to have a PCAC meeting or any meeting.
We agree.
But we, you know, partly because not all the members are here, partly because it needs ongoing, and I think we're probably going to want to come back with you with some more information and possibly draft language in November. So what we've been thinking is that in November we take the opportunity to have a remote meeting to make life a bit easier for the members at a busy time of year, but we would have to move the night of the meeting as well. So we've already identified actually with Chair Colbert that she would be willing to participate in a meeting if it's the choice of the committee to move your meeting up from the 4th Wednesday to the 3rd Wednesday, and move the time up from 6:30 to 5 p.m. but to do the meeting remotely. Now that may not work for everybody, but in the past it seems to have worked for most people to do that. So that would be our option. As Mr. Longer said, that I think you said that the authority has asked us to come back with some draft policy by the end of the year. So in order for you to have some influence on that, you would have to meet in November. Obviously, if it's the will of the committee to say, we're good, we've got no interest, go ahead. You know, as Mr. Long says, then that's something we could take into account. But I'm not sure you would be comfortable doing that with, you know, not having a quorum, only having 4 of your 14 members present.
If I may, I will be so bold as I was at TAC. It would be helpful, given the constrained timeline, without any obligation that a sense of direction is permanent and, you know, subject to change, to at least get an idea of which direction folks were leaning towards formally funding cost overruns or towards not funding cost overruns. Again, there's no quorum here, but I've got a lot of work to do in December, and it's a huge difference in terms of policy development if we are going to walk down that alley again or choose not to.
Go ahead.
What I'm hearing you say is that we never dig deep into the project to find out what's going on. So if we were to take on a cost overrun position, we would have to dig deep into it. You know, because I'm just going to say, yeah, you go ahead and do it. And not knowing that there is a potential problem there that may cost us $3, $4, $5 million in overrun.
Mm-hmm.
So that's consideration. I'm thinking, okay, we were to do this, and we have to do some other steps, policies, and checkpoints. And if
Staff
we
and
didn't-
contractor augmentation.
Right. I don't know all those terms, but we're going through that same thing in town. So, we have the 7690 project coming in, and it's been on the books for 30 years. So I know the cost they predicted 30 years ago is not even close to what they're talking about now. So, yeah, it's a big step.
Anyone else? Yeah, and to me, I just don't see how it could be implemented. When you take into factors that you can foresee with the overhead extending, when you think about the fact that it could be retroactive, how do you support it without potentially bankrupting NVTA. So I just don't see how we could, how we could in good faith support it. But with that being said, there are 10 other of us. We could all say, we could all be on the same side of no, and then in November, we find ourselves in minority. But my initial reaction to the, I just don't see how it seems like a great idea, but I don't see how it's possible, or if it's, you know, we have too many limitations and too much can go wrong with that. So I'm not a fan. Okay. So if no one else has any questions or comments. Okay.
Is it possible with our next meeting that if anybody else has questions that you would come back and answer them? Okay. I would agree with you, Vice Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so that's that. So at that point, Mr. Longy, did you have anything else that you wanted to?
No, thank you for your time, and hopefully next time you come, the doors will be open. The elevator will be.
Thank you so much. So I'm gonna
Thank you.
turn the floor over to Mr. Jasper. Or did we invert, did we put those in the room?
Yeah,
Okay.
I does just quickly mention for the upcoming 6-year program, which we anticipate will have a call for regional projects in May of next year. That we're broadly looking to use the same methodology that we've used in previous 6-year program update cycles. You may recall there was a discussion about our core values of equity, safety, and sustainability, and how we incorporate that into our project recommendation process. For the last cycle, for the first time, we did ask our project applicants to provide what we call a core value statement, addressing each of our core values for each of the project applications. But it was voluntary, and so some did and some didn't. And for those that didn't, we basically had to figure that out for ourselves based on the project descriptions and discussions with the applicant staff. But the concern that was expressed, and we generally agree with, is that if we use that approach to looking at core values, there's a potential for double counting, because we also, as part of our analytical process, include some elements of equity, safety, and sustainability in our quantitative approach. So to do it on a quantitative basis and then do it again on a qualitative basis could result in some potential double counting situations, and we agree we want to avoid those. We still think there is value in looking at how projects align themselves with NVTA's core values, but to not make that a formal part of the project's recommendation process, but just to report separately that we looked at the core values and how the projects align, and we found X, Y, or Z. What we generally show is a high, medium, low type scale of alignment, which we share with you, I think, in your May meeting of this year. So we'll probably want to do something like that, keep it outside of the formal process, but still report on it. So the only real difference we're likely to make is those core value statements that we're looking for, which were voluntary in the last cycle. We're almost certainly going to make them mandatory in this cycle, and essentially, if we don't get those, then we won't advance the project through our process. So a little bit of motivation to get those in, but we think it's better that everybody provides their own statement of core value alignment and not leave, say, half the projects, depending on NVTA staff, to figure that out, when really it's in the interest of the project sponsors to tell us that these applications are supportive of our core values. So that aside, I don't think we're expecting to see any changes of note in the process, but we're always happy to discuss suggestions and refinements to our approach. We don't want to let the grass grow under our feet if there is a better way of doing things. But at the moment, we're not seeing much likelihood of any changes other than the one I outlined. So that's really all I have for that item.
I think anybody have any questions or comments?
If I could briefly.
Sure.
Yes. I'm just curious, and again, like this is I'm newer to this process, and I've been through, I think, each step once now over the last, 2.5 years. And to what extent has the past 6-year program application process, and might you can revise or rethink moving forward, evaluating the degree to which these projects induce demand? Because I can appreciate where I am, obviously, we're very multimodal, but as some of the other jurisdictions are really focused more on road projects. And so there's obviously short-term and mid-term sometimes benefits to, moving cars faster and having wider roads, but then there's those longer-term impacts where you induce a certain kind of, expectation about driving places. And so I'm just curious, as the program evolves, are we examining, the way that induced demand is evaluated, short, mid, and long term with project applications?
No, I'm thank you for the question. We are mindful of the issues associated with induced demand. We are taking what steps we can to actually monitor the performance of our projects as to whether there's any evidence that they are inducing demand. It is very difficult to actually detect hard evidence that any project is inducing demand, because certain things need to be in play. And one of which is, as you alluded to, is that some of these effects take a long time to actually be seen. And you can switch maybe from a project having reducing travel or improving reliability or speeds or whatever throughput in the short term, and then that may or may not change, may or may not continue into the long term. We've only been doing this for 10 years now, so it's probably way too soon for those long-term impacts to really be detectable. And then when they might be detectable, the question is, are there a whole bunch of other external factors that disguise them? So it's something we're mindful of. Our methodology, our modeling process actually does incorporate some induced demand in it. So we actually are taking account of some of the shorter term induced demand that you mentioned within our modeling process. To that extent, it is addressed.
I think something I just might find helpful as we prepare to evaluate the next set of applications. You mentioned, we're 10 years in now. It might be useful as we're evaluating applications if there's a project that is similar in some way to a project that's been fully executed and implemented, to maybe cite to it somehow. Give us a few facts about how that project that was funded 10 years ago has been fully built and is in play, so we can see how some of these funding decisions are playing out in the real world. Because I appreciate the many factors you all put in to ranking the projects. It would be useful with each cycle that goes forward to maybe give us as much long view as we have the benefit of, to say, similar projects like this 5 years out, 10 years out are showing. Because I'd like to know, it would give me greater comfort, I guess, when we're voting and signing off, that expanding these roads or creating this large interchange, yes, we'll have the likely results that we feel confident predicting, right after it's done, but also potentially appears to maintain those benefits 5 years out, where we'd see similar projects. That would just give me some comfort that we are learning from each cycle.
We do want to do that. I have to be honest with you. The data that we would need to rigorously be able to evaluate and point to specific effects is huge. And as Mr. Longley has described, with bureaucracy we might need to establish in order to look at contingencies associated with to see whether cost overruns might happen. It's probably not on that scale. It's more a question of, does the data even exist to be able to do it? robustly. So I mean, we will keep looking at it. The easiest thing we can do is to look at in certain locations where bigger projects have been established. I mean, particularly we're talking about roads here, right? So I mean, it's like there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of concern about rail projects inducing demand. It's more about road projects. So we would need to pick some large projects to see what effects they're having.
Ms. Backman has her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's just.
No, thank you. And thank you for bearing with me. I had another meeting this evening, but I wanted to know regarding induced demand, it is interesting because with each funding program, and I know people automatically account for or assume induced demand with roads, and that's a negative thing, whereas induced demand with transit is positive, but we can't talk about induced demand without acknowledging the increases in population and employment. And we know in this region that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, which is one of the reasons why we're truly multimodal. COG's annual commute, state of commute survey told us, and we put some of this information in transaction, if you're low income, you're 3 times as likely to drive because of housing attainability or affordability, which word you want to use, and where some of the jobs are located. So I think it's a lot more nuanced, because we don't want to send a message that, oh, we put too much money into one particular mode, so we should stop doing that, without fully considering the other factors, as Keith noted, that goes into that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Oh, and I mean, for what it's worth, I'm entirely sympathetic to the complexities, you know what I mean, that are interactive here. I just, I appreciate the points you raised, that you sort of want to induce into other methods as hope and means of reducing congestion on roads as well. Do road projects, do congestion, but we could do other projects to reduce congestion. But I'm very sensitive and sympathetic to the data plight that you're describing.
Yeah. I would just say we do a lane miles analysis just to kind of keep a sense of grounding here. And I think when we look at the lane miles associated with active transportation and dedicated transit right-of-way, and compare that to lane miles on roadways that are associated with NVTA funded projects, that while not equal, those numbers are pretty similar. So I don't want you to have the impression that we're a road building entity and we're funding hundreds of miles of new lane miles for roadways, because the actual facts don't bear that out. And I would personally take issue that a roadway widening or a new road is even if it does induce demand, it may have other beneficial effects that more than outweigh any concerns about induced demand. For instance, filling in grid systems to find different ways to give people travel options through the system is a very effective tool, particularly when those new elements of a grid system include dedicated right of way for transit and walkers and some pedestrians. So, it's complicated and it's nuanced, but we're sensitive to it. I just want to share that it's very hard to kind of go from a general statement to actually.
Thank you. And see, Ms. Backman, did she still have her hand raised from earlier? Is that? Yeah. Did it just?
Sorry.
Okay. Okay. But in any event, the next item on the agenda is an NVTA update from Ms. Backman. So Ms. Backman, the floor is yours.
If she's unable to speak for herself, I think she'll want me to mention that next Wednesday is what we're calling our State of the Region's Transportation System event. It's an inaugural event. I believe Irene has forwarded an invitation to you. I realize that 8:30 in the morning on a Wednesday is not necessarily a good fit for your other schedules. But if you are interested in participating in that, then let Haroon know, and he'll give you the link to the registration. It is almost completely full. It'll be in this room, and so we have to kind of look at the capacity of this room. So it's pretty close to being reaching the room capacity. But if you're interested, it'll be interesting because it's a big step for us in looking at the sort of thing that you were talking about in terms of looking at the impact of what NVTA is doing and how the region's transportation system is performing, looking at establishing a benchmark in 2024, and then in future years looking to see what has changed, how much closer are we getting to reaching NVTA's vision and goals for the region, that so much of the money that NVTA is investing is working towards. So I think it'll be an interesting meeting if you're able to attend.
And thank you, Keith. I'm here now. I was having issues with sound on my end, but yes, that was going to be my report. So thanks, Keith, for covering.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments?
Thank you for the presentation.
Yeah. Yes, Supervisor Glass.
Thank you. Is there an opportunity for virtual access to the meeting next Wednesday you're talking about?
No, we're not providing virtual access to it. Unfortunately, the logistics are such that, and because we're so new to the facility, we don't want to take on the commitment of a live stream, and we're not sure it would really enhance the meeting. So on this occasion, we're not offering that, I'm afraid. But we'll be happy to give the committee a review of what happened either at your next meeting or at another opportunity in the near future, and share that with you.
All of this equipment is so new. There are some technicians that I only know them from like their knees down because I only see them up in the ceilings, standing on ladders.
You don't have to protect yourself yet.
I mean, it is working, but we've not quite mastered it yet.
We don't feel that confident in our own ability to do it right. We don't want the technology to dominate the experience. We just want the information to dominate the experience. So on this occasion,
But we have built out the facility that events like that in the future we'll be able to do virtually.
Yeah.
If you look in this room, it's 4 cameras, floating around.
Okay, so if there's no further business, we are adjourned.
Oh, works for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Pick a sandwich.
I hope you all can take those places.
Was hungry. No.